The Woodville is often seen as the upstart hussy who seduced her way to the top, but modern historians have revealed a much more complicated story. As the first child of a controversial couple, scandal was in Elizabeth Woodville's blood. Her mother was the widow of King Henry I's younger brother, but when it came time to choose husband number 2, she passed on the royals and wed a mere knight named Sir Richard Woodville. The mismatched couple dropped jaws at the English court and infuriated the king. Elizabeth Woodville's parents were literal outlaws. How many queens of England can say that their birth was literally against the law? The 1400s weren't about waiting around. They were about making babies as soon as possible. To do her part, Elizabeth Woodville walked down the aisle when she was just 15 years old and married a knight named Sir John Grey. Soon enough, Woodville won the medieval jackpot and gave birth to 2 sons. However, her wedded bliss wouldn't last very long. Long story short, during the Wars of the Roses, the Yorks and the Lancasters played an exhausting, bloody game of crown swap. After decades of conflict, the Lancasters lost, and King Edward IV took the throne. For the Yorks, this was great, but for Elizabeth Woodville, who was a Lancaster through and through, it was a disaster, and the bad news kept coming. During the final phases of the conflict, enemy forces captured her brother and her father. Before Woodville and Grey even reached their 10th anniversary, their marriage was already done. Woodville's first husband had fought in the brutal Battle of St. Albans, and, unfortunately, he didn't make it out alive. With her husband's passing, Woodville became a 28-year-old widow and a single mother, and now she had to deal with her hellish in-laws all alone. Although Woodville was promised money in her marriage settlement, her in-laws refused to send her any funds to help her and her children survive. Desperate, poor, and widowed, Woodville only had one option left for survival: betray her family's Lancastrian roots and beg the new king to help her out. Woodville's evil in-laws weren't budging, so to get her money, our girl had to take her fight to the new king, who was awkwardly her sworn enemy. However, their meeting didn't exactly go according to plan, and in the end, Woodville got a heck of a lot more than she bargained for. She went hoping to receive a pittance, and she left with a wedding ring and a crown. Here is how. How does a single mom meet a guy who will treat her like a queen? In the days before dating apps, all you had to do was stand under an oak tree and wait for the king to ride by. Or at least, that's all it took for a hottie like Elizabeth Woodville. In this version of King Edward IV and Elizabeth's meet cute, our girl used her legendary beauty to catch the king's eye. As Elizabeth explained her plight to the king, he was instantly smitten. In some tellings of their love story, Edward meets Elizabeth, immediately falls for her, and insists that she become his mistress. Woodville resists the king's advances and plays hard to get, which obviously leads Edward to become even more obsessed with his new flame. In some versions of this story, Liz plays her cards so well that after meeting the king, she goes from destitute widow to queen in just 3 weeks. No matter how they met, here's what we know for certain. It didn't take long for Edward and Elizabeth to make things official. The new couple tied the knot in a ceremony at a chapel in Woodville's family home in Northamptonshire. Edward knew that marrying a commoner wouldn't go over well with his advisors, so he threw caution to the wind and had an impulsive Vegas-style wedding and let future Edward deal with the blowback. This plan went about as well as you'd expect. Courtiers weren't the only ones who'd been ticked to learn about the wedding. You see, when it came to the ladies, Elizabeth's new hubby had a policy of promise to marry, hit it, then quit it. In fact, at the same time as Elizabeth married the king, it was rumored that Edward's previous mistress was heavily pregnant and waiting for her marriage to the king. I see an awkward conversation in Liz and Ed's future. Edward's key advisor, the infamous kingmaker Richard Neville, had been busy setting up a strategic French marriage for the king. Everything was locked and loaded, until Edward revealed that actually, He couldn't marry a French hottie because he'd already eloped with Woodville. The faux pas made Neville seem like a lying fool in the eyes of the French court. Angry and embarrassed, Neville would hold a murderous grudge against both the king and Woodville herself for years to come. Neville wasn't the only one who hated the idea of Queen Elizabeth Woodville. All of the English nobles were ticked. Contemporary accounts called Elizabeth undistinguished, and rumors about Woodville's super-seductress ways spread far and wide. The people believed that the king had been led by his, nether regions, and that the impulsive match was a huge mistake. And that wasn't all. As though being a commoner and a widow wasn't controversial enough, did I mention that Elizabeth Woodville was also a bit of a cougar? At 28, she was a scandalous 5 years older than her new husband. Everyone hated Elizabeth Woodville, but like it or not, she was the new queen, and new queens get lavish coronations. Edward cleverly used the occasion as a way to legitimize his new bride. He hired people to dress as angels, bought Elizabeth an expensive purple gown, and even made London smell okay, which back in the 1400s was a big achievement. Thankfully, all these expenses did the trick. On May 26, 1465, the coronation's pomp and splendor, along with Elizabeth's jaw-dropping beauty, won the people over for now, at least. Remember Elizabeth's enemy, the kingmaker, Richard Neville? Well, all these advantageous Woodville marriages only made him hate Elizabeth more. He felt that his family were the ones who should have been marrying up, not the ambitious Woodvilles. As he watched Elizabeth's relatives call dibs on all the eligible court hotties, he saw his family's chances to gain power go up in smoke. And then Elizabeth went too far. Neville's nephew was supposed to nab a wealthy heiress until Elizabeth pettily stole the girl away and married her off to her own son. With this final insult, Neville officially lost it. In 1470, he lashed out against the royal couple. He partnered up with King Edward's ambitious younger brother and staged a rebellion to replace King Edward with England's old ruler, Henry VI. When Neville staged his coup, King Edward told Elizabeth to run away and take shelter with her children. Elizabeth got out of Dodge just in the nick of time. After she left, everything devolved. Enemy forces captured Edward. Then his commanders screwed the pooch and lost a major battle. When all was said and done, King Henry VI reclaimed the throne, while King Edward and Elizabeth Woodville lost everything. Unfortunately for Elizabeth, things would get worse before they got better. Richard Neville, the mastermind behind Henry's takeover, made things personal. He declared that Elizabeth and her mother were witches, and that Elizabeth had used dark magic to ensnare King Edward IV. Neville then did something far worse. He captured and beheaded Elizabeth's brother and her father. In a matter of months, Elizabeth had gone from the Queen of England to a desperate, grieving mother. In 1470, her husband had been exiled to France, and she had moved into Westminster Abbey to hide from her enemies. As though that wasn't enough for Woodville to deal with, the entire time this mess was going down, Elizabeth was heavily pregnant. Elizabeth Woodville was one tough lady. Even though her life was a dumpster fire, she persevered and gave birth to a baby boy in the basement of Westminster Abbey. She named her son Edward, and even though she and her hubby had technically been deposed, Elizabeth ignored that little detail and thought of the infant as the heir to the throne of England. Little did she know she was right to get her hopes up. A lot had happened while Liz was locked up in Westminster. By May of 1471, King Edward had staged a legendary comeback. He rallied his French allies, persuaded one of Neville's co-conspirators to switch sides, and charged back into England to defeat the infamous kingmaker. After a decisive victory at Barnet, Edward deposed his competition. Richard Neville, meanwhile, fell off his horse and got trampled. With her husband back as king, Elizabeth Woodville re-entered the real-life Game of Thrones. In April 1483, Elizabeth's husband passed under ambiguous circumstances at just 40 years old. Some say that he had a chill. Others insist that his debauched ways had finally caught up to him. No matter what caused the king to keel over, his demise left Elizabeth Woodville a widow and single mother to the future king. During the turbulent 1400s, this was a very dangerous position to be in. Elizabeth knew that to ensure her safety and the safety of her family, she'd have to act fast. In the king's will, Edward appointed his brother, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, to become the Lord Protector of little Prince Edward, the heir to the throne. Unfortunately, it turns out that Richard was incredibly ambitious. With his big brother out of the picture, he immediately used his new position to grab power for himself. He promised Elizabeth that he'd keep Prince Edward safe, but unfortunately, he lied. Big time. After getting his hands on Prince Edward, Richard went to work destroying the rest of Elizabeth's family. He arrested both her brother and one of her sons from her first marriage, Richard Grey, then suspiciously delayed the coronation of Prince Edward, even saying that the tides were turning and her entire family would soon be in big trouble. Woodville rushed herself into sanctuary once again. While Elizabeth hid out at an abbey with her children, Richard was busy running one heck of a PR campaign. He made the public think that he was somehow protecting the prince, instead of, abducting him and trying to usurp his power. He also ran Elizabeth's name through the mud. In 1483, he accused her of trying to murder and utterly destroy him from her sanctuary. Not sure how that would work, but okay. To be fair to Richard, Elizabeth probably did want to wring his neck, but at this particular moment in time, he had all of the power, and she had none. Case in point, when Richard was no longer satisfied with just abducting the heir to the throne, he turned his eye to the spare as well. His men surrounded the abbey where Elizabeth Woodville was hiding, and demanded that she hand over her other son. Elizabeth's reaction to this demand has puzzled historians for centuries. Prepare to rage. Defying all of her maternal instincts, Elizabeth handed over her son. Yes, this was a terrible idea, but in Elizabeth's defense, she didn't really have a choice. In most versions of this story, Elizabeth only gives the boy up because she is under extreme duress. She's literally surrounded by Richard's men. So after making the archbishop promise that her son won't be harmed, she reluctantly gave Richard the boy. This was a huge mistake. This is the point where Richard gives up all pretense of being a protective uncle. He makes it clear that he's out for power, and that anyone standing in his way is toast. First, he executes Elizabeth's brother and one of her sons from her first marriage. Then, despite all his promises to the contrary, he imprisons Elizabeth's beloved sons, Prince Edward and his little brother, in the Tower of London. After spreading all the dirt, Richard dissolved Elizabeth's marriage to Edward, declared the Woodville children illegitimate, and barred them from inheriting the throne. He deposed Prince Edward in 1483, declared himself King Richard III of England, and for good measure threw in one final reminder that Elizabeth Woodville was a witch. Then he hurt the ex-queen in the worst way possible. After the summer of 1483, when Elizabeth reluctantly handed over her two sons to Richard III and his henchmen, there would be no more sightings of Woodville's sons. The lost boys are now known to history as the tragic princes in the tower. No one knows for sure what happened to them, but for centuries people have believed that Richard executed the brothers. They were just 12 and 9 years old at the time. Woodville defied everyone's expectations by working with another old frenemy, Margaret Beaufort, and trying to bring Richard down. In October of 1483, the women became involved in Buckingham's rebellion. The plan was stunning. Beaufort's son, Henry Tudor, would come to England, defeat Richard, take the throne, and marry Woodville's daughter, thus uniting both Yorks and Lancasters. Unfortunately, things did not go to plan. Richard III caught wind of the rebellion and immediately shut it down, putting Elizabeth in a tricky situation. She effectively had to make a deal with the devil, aka Richard himself. Woodville said that if Richard let her and her daughters safely leave the abbey, she wouldn't make any more trouble for him. Richard agreed, but he had one sickening condition. Elizabeth had to live at his court and tacitly support his reign. Yep, if Elizabeth wanted survival, she'd have to play nice with the man who killed her sons. Thankfully, things were about to change in a big way. Henry VII invaded England in 1485, defeated Richard III, and successfully seized the throne. In his victory speech, the new King Henry declared that little Prince Edward was legitimate, then restored Elizabeth Woodville back to her former glory as Dowager Queen. He had at last got all her land and money back, but if you think Henry was doing this out of the goodness of his heart, guess again. Henry's kindness to Elizabeth and her daughters wasn't purely altruistic. It was also a way for him to bolster his own power. After all, he stuck to the plan where he'd marry Woodville's daughter, and it wasn't like a king could marry a disgraced woman. By restoring Elizabeth Woodville, he also restored her daughter, and crucially his future bride. With this advantageous marriage completed, Elizabeth was ready to settle back into court, but her daughter was ready to marry. Her life had other plans. After defeating her husband, Woodville, Richard, and her old frenemy, Margaret Bow, in 1485, and successfully defeating Richard III, after this defeat, Woodville and she went back to her old rivalrous ways with Margaret Beaufort. They drove each other nuts in a petty battle of the Dowager Queens, new queen, and eventually Beaufort edged out Woodville. After this defeat, Elizabeth went to retirement at yet another abbey. Some say she went to her latest retreat, kicking and screaming. Others insist that the Dowager Queen went to retirement into a religious life more willingly. This is based on evidence that the Queen had already been planning her retirement into a religious life as early as 1 year into Henry V Tudor's reign. After losing her father, brother, brothers, and her sons to the violence of court politics, it's not a stretch to imagine that Woodville would welcome some peace and quiet. She'd finally get them in February of after 1487, but not for long. I think it's safe to say that over the years' time, Elizabeth Woodville and her son-in-law Henry VII's relationship had soured pretty intensely, even though he was A, her son-in-law, the king, B, a king, her son-in-law, and C, the only reason she'd escaped from the clutches of Richard III. Elizabeth Woodville very conspicuously omits Henry VII from her last will and testament. Sounds like some icy family dinners went down in the castle. And so, after that, 55 years of Elizabeth Woodville's non-stop drama, her health began to decline, deteriorate. On June 8, 1492, Elizabeth Woodville finally breathed her last at Bermondsey Abbey, where she had spent her final years in low-key retirement, or been low-key, imprisoned for her the last 5 years. The royal family said goodbye to their mother and prepared her for her funeral at Windsor Castle. In the end, after all, Woodville was buried in the same chantry as her beloved father, brother, second husband, King Edward IV. She and they lie together at St. George's Chapel inside Windsor Castle. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you enjoyed uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to Keep Exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factorn, for more incredible facts about everything history.